Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven.
Hi everyone. This is just going to be a short video to introduce you to one of the most important documents in American history, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. You're going to hear about it in the first few chapters of our course, and I'll talk about it in class. And this video will just be a place for you to go and listen again in case you missed anything, or if you're reviewing and want to go back and brush up on things we did earlier in the year. Thomas Paine's Common Sense is an important document not only in history but for our course as well. I like to think of it as a way for us to understand what powerful writing can do and how we might use it for ourselves, especially as we write for the AP US History College Board exam. The document shows us how to write argumentative, evidence-based arguments. And he does it really well. In fact, he does it so well, he sparked a revolution. He became quite wealthy and world famous as a result of this 5-page pamphlet. It shows the power of the printed word, and that in 5 pages a man can overthrow a government, spark a revolution, and become a world-known writer. Thomas Paine. He starts it out in an interesting way, and I wanted to point that out to you here. I'm going to be using some highlighting here to show you. He starts out in his introductory paragraph right here. Let's see if I can get this to work. Sorry about that. He says, perhaps the sentiments contained in the following pages are yet sufficiently fashionable to procure them a general favor. He's basically saying, maybe everything I'm saying is going to be popular. He goes on and says, a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right and raises at first a formidable outcry in defense of a custom. So he's basically saying what I'm about to tell you isn't going to really be popular because what you've been thinking is normal and right is only because it's been around a long time. And he's going to challenge us to rethink our expectations, our assumptions about what's right. He says because something that's been not been thought of as wrong, it might be thought of as right, just through absence of critical thought. So he begins to challenge us to think and rethink about what America's all about by saying that just because we haven't thought of these things, don't discard them as wrong. Question whether your assumptions are right in the first place. He goes on and he starts right here. He says, the cause of America is, in a great measure, the cause of all mankind. That's pretty bold. Many circumstances have and will arise which are not local but universal, and through which the principle all lovers of mankind are affected, and in the event of which their affections are interested. The laying of a country desolate with fire and sword, declaring war against the natural rights of mankind, and extirpating the defenders thereof in the face of the earth, is the concern of every man to whom nature hath given the power of feeling, of which class, regardless of party, censure is the author. Well, that's a long-winded way of saying we should all really care about this, because if you're in this continent of America, then you care about the cause of all mankind. And what happens here affects everyone everywhere. That's important because that idea that America is the leader of the world is something that we're going to see starts early and continues even till now. It's a presumption, it's an assumption, it's a bigotry, it's a bias. And you can see it right there, that America is the cause of all mankind. That's what we call American exceptionalism, that America is the best and everyone needs to follow us. We'll get more into that later, and we'll come back to it repeatedly, but I want to point it out here. And he's also using it to sort of say, you should care about this. Don't disregard what I'm saying just because it may be unpopular. If you care about the country, if you care about all mankind, then you should care about what I'm saying. So that's a great way for us to understand a good introduction as well. When we write for this course, we're going to want to worry about how do we introduce these topics, and finding a way to bring your reader in and connect with them is important. And making what you say as important to everyone in the world is an interesting tactic, and one I would recommend. He goes on to talk more about what he's going to do. So we're still in sort of the introduction at this point. And he says, in the following pages I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. He says it right here. I have no other preliminaries to settle with the reader than he will divest himself of prejudice and prepossession, and suffer his reason and his feelings to determine for themselves, that he will put on, or rather that he will not put off, the true character of a man, and generously enlarge his views beyond the present day. So here he's basically saying, look, I'm just going to present the facts to you. And if you can be open-minded about the facts, I think you'll understand what I'm saying. That's it. That's all he says there. I'm just going to tell you the facts. Don't be biased against me until you hear what I have to say. Now we get into the real subject of what he's talking about. He says, volumes have been written on the subject and struggle between England and America. The sun never shine on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 the part of the inhabitable globe. So here he's saying, look, the problem we're talking about is a big one, and it's one everyone's talking about. The problem that we know exists between England and the American colonies. So he's alerting his reader, you know what I'm talking about here. There's a big problem brewing, and I'm going to tell you about it. And it's a big problem not just to you and me, but because it takes up much of the globe, 1/8. He goes on and says, "'Tis not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest, and will be more or less affected even to the end of time by the proceedings now." So this isn't going to be something that's over now. What comes out of this conflict will affect the rest of the world for all time. It sounds like a little bit of an overstatement, but obviously the American Revolution has affected the world ever since it took place. And the role of the United States, for good or for bad, is one that can't be discarded. It is a major world event. He goes on and he says, "Now is the seed time of continual union, faith, and honor. The least fracture now will be like a name engraved on the point of a pin on the tender rind of a young oak. The wound will enlarge with the tree, and the posterity read it in full characters." Right? So, I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you carve your initials into a tree, over time those initials get bigger as the tree grows and expands. And so what he's saying here is that this conflict will grow over time to have a larger significance. And in many ways, he's right, because the American Revolution has grown in significance over time to have a greater importance, obviously, as the growth of the country and the power of the country have expanded. All right, so he says, he goes on to talk a lot about why this is important, but here we see how he introduces it. He really talks about the significance of it in history, in geography, and in terms of politics. All right, so in this next passage, let me make it a little bit bigger for us. He goes on to say some of the arguments, and he's going to go into a counter-argument approach. And that's what I want you to think about as you begin to think about how you're going to write for this course. You don't necessarily just have to argue in favor of something. You could structure your arguments in writing against points, and by defeating those points, you can prove you're right. And that's what he's doing here. He says he's going to talk in this paragraph right here. "I have heard it asserted by some that America has flourished under their former connection with Great Britain, that the same connection is necessary towards her future happiness and will always have the same effect." Right, so here he's starting to break down the arguments against revolution. And at this point in American history, most Americans were not in favor of revolution against Great Britain. They thought of themselves as British. They didn't want to leave. It'd be like if somebody came to you and say, "Hey, let's revolt, let's break away California, pick up arms, shoot some soldiers, and create a new country called the Republic of California." Well, you might like that, but when it comes down to really picking up that gun, you might need a little pep talk. And that's what he's really doing here. He's sort of saying, let's really talk about what we're doing here and see how it's important. And let me explain to you why some of the arguments you might think are against revolution don't really stand up. He goes on and says, "Nothing can be more fallacious than this kind of argument." He says basically that it's not good for America to be connected to Great Britain, that we haven't flourished under that connection. He goes on and says, "We may as well assert that the child has thrived upon milk, that it is never to have meat, or that the first 20 years of our lives is to become the precedent for the next 20. But even this is admitting more than is true, for I answer roundly that America would have flourished as much, and probably much more, had no European power had anything to do with her. The commerce by which she has enriched herself are the necessities and necessaries of life, and will always have a market, while eating is the custom of Europe. So here he uses a couple of really interesting things. He brings up this example of a baby, a child who's thrived upon milk, right, as a way to defeat the idea that, hey, America's doing great. We've always prospered under England. Why do we want to leave? Well, you know, when you were a baby, you prospered under your mama's milk, but that doesn't mean now that you're a grown adult, you're going to go back and suckle at your mother's breast. It would be ridiculous. Or it'd be weird to say, hey, look, I've done really well for the first 20 years, so I'm definitely going to do well for the next 20 years. No, that's not how reality works. Obviously, times change, and just because something was good before doesn't mean it's going to be good in the future. So he's breaking down that argument using some really simple metaphors. And you should do that too. Try and bring metaphors into your writing about U.S. history. It'll show your understanding and make your message easier for the reader to understand as well. He goes on and says, she, and when he says she, he's talking about Great Britain. He says, she has protected us, say some, let me get rid of that. She has protected us, say some. That she has engrossed us is true. Defended the continent at our expense is well known, is admitted. That she would have defended Turkey from the same motive, meaning the sake of trade and dominion. So it's interesting here in this little paragraph. He says he's addressing the argument that England has protected the colonies, and they did, right, during the French and Indian War. They protected the colonies. And he admits that. He says, yeah, it's absolutely true. She protected us. But she would also have protected Turkey for the same reason. And it's not a good reason. It's not a noble reason. It's just for sake of trade and control, dominion being control. Right? He says, England doesn't protect the colonies because she loves the people. She protects the colonies because the colonies work for her. She protects the colonies because she demands control over the colonies. He's basically attacking that whole line of argument. It's a beautiful thing. Now, he goes on, alas, right here he says, alas, we have long been led away by ancient prejudices and made large sacrifices to superstition. We've boasted the protection of Great Britain without considering that her motive was interest, not attachment, that she did not protect us from our enemies on our account, but from her enemies on her own account, and from those who had no quarrel with us on either account, and who will always be our enemies on the same account. Let Britain waive her pretensions to the continent, or the continent throw off the dependence, and we should be at peace with France and Spain were they at war with Britain. The miseries of Hanover last war ought warn us against connections. So in this one, he basically says, look, it's just a continuation of the previous paragraph where he talks about Turkey. He says, look, all of our wars and all of our troubles aren't because England is protecting us. It's because England's getting us in trouble in the first place. And just the fact that she's protecting us ignores the reason we're in trouble altogether. And if we really think about it, we wouldn't be at war with France or Spain if we were independent of England. We would be doing fine. We'd be doing trade with France and England. It's all because England gets us in trouble. So she's not really protecting us. She's getting us in trouble. It's an interesting turn. He says, it's repugnant to reason. This is great when he brings this up. Repugnant is a great word, by the way, and you should use it whenever you can. It means something that's gross or disgusting or completely rejected. He says, it's repugnant to reason, to the universal order of things, to all examples of the former ages, to suppose that this continent can long remain subject to any external power. He says, it's just ridiculous to think that we can be controlled. We're a continent. The most sanguine in Britain does not think so. The utmost stretch of human wisdom cannot at this time compass a plan short of separation, which can promise the continent even a year's security. Reconciliation is now a fallacious dream. Nature has deserted the connection, and art cannot supply her place. For, as Milton wisely expresses, never can true reconcilement grow where wounds of deadly hate have pierced so deep. Well, that's beautiful. But let me explain what it says. So he says, basically, we can't be controlled by this continent, and it's too late to try to reconcile. He says, reconciliation is a fallacious dream. Sorry, let me get rid of that. Fallacious being false. It's a false dream. It's a fantasy. He says nature has deserted the connection, meaning the reality isn't there, and art cannot supply our place. He says you can't just paper this over. You can't just sing some patriotic songs. You can't wave a few flags like art and make me feel like I'm English again. He says the wounds are too deep to go back. Right? It's too late. That's his argument. He says not only is it not possible, it's also too late. All right. He goes on to explain why. He says every method of peace has been ineffectual. Our prayers have been rejected and only tend to convince us that nothing flatters vanity or confirms obstinacy in kings where more than repeated petitioning and nothing has contributed more to that very measure to make the kings of Europe absolute. Witness Denmark and Sweden. He says, look, you can't negotiate with these people, right? They are absolute rulers. They do whatever they want to do. They don't need to listen to us. They think they're chosen by God. And why would they listen to another human being if God has chosen them to be wise among all men and the rulers of great nations? Absolute rulers don't listen to the people. The people listen to absolute rulers. So he says there's no way for us to negotiate or reconcile or make peace. It's just not possible. All right, so he goes on, and this is where it gets really interesting. He says, but where, says some, is the King of America? Right? This is really important because, we don't have a king. Well, he says, I'll tell you, friend. Notice how he's talking to the reader as a person who might be standing in front of him, as a friend on the street corner. This is a really important break with tradition in writing, which was usually just about ideas and not directed at any one in particular. But here, he's actually trying to convince the reader that he's on his side. First, he says, just listen to me. I've got just some facts I want to share with you. Try not to be, closed-minded. And now he's saying, you're my friend. See, he's slowly co-opting him in that sense. He says, I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above, meaning the King of America, reigns above and does not make havoc of mankind like the Royal of Britain. Well, when he says he reigns above, he's talking about God, right? He says the King of America doesn't cause trouble. The King of America is God, and God doesn't trouble us. Yet that we may not appear to be defective, even in earthly honors, let a day be solemnly set apart for proclaiming the charter. Well, that day that we set aside for proclaiming the charter of America at the time he wrote this was Sunday, when people went to church. He says the King of America is God, and we don't have a day in which we worship the King of America. We do it every Sunday, right? He says, let the word of God, let a crown be placed thereupon, by which the world may know, so far as we approve of monarchy, that in America, the law is king. The law is king. Oh, let me get rid of that. That is huge. It may not seem like a big deal, but realize never before in human history had anyone ever said that, right? That these kings who they claimed were chosen by God weren't really. He's now bringing the Enlightenment in and saying, look, we don't do that here in America. We worship God, but we are ruled by the law. And that's a break. That's a revolutionary break, right? Because no one is above the law. Whereas in the absolute monarchies of Europe, the king was above the law. The king was the law. He says, for in absolute governments, the king is law. So in free countries, the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. But lest any ill use should afterwards arise, let the crown at the conclusion of the ceremony be demolished and scattered among the people whose right it is. Whoa! I'm gonna outline that because I think that may be one of the most interesting parts. At the conclusion of the ceremony, right? Meaning at the end of the the king's life, and in this case, it's the law. If the law no longer fits, do away with the law, change it, right? Isn't that exactly what we do in the United States? We have laws, and when they no longer work, we change those laws. And we don't let some one person tell us when the law is and when it isn't. The people have the right to do it. Now that's huge because, again, he's giving rights to the people. That has never happened before in history. This is the beginning of that. This is what makes America unique, what makes America revolutionary and special. He says, a government of our own is our own natural right. And when man seriously reflects upon the precariousness, meaning the fragility, the gentleness, the delicacy, the delicateness of his human affairs, he'll become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own in a cool, deliberate manner while we have that in our power than to trust such an interesting event to time and place. He says, we need to form a law. We need to form a constitution. He says, should the government of America return to the hands of Britain, the tottering situation of things will be the temptation for some desperate adventurer to try his fortune. And what relief can Britain give? Right? He says, basically, if we go back into England, somebody else is going to try and take us over. They're always going to be looking to get us. Right? He says, ye that oppose independence now, you know not what ye do. You are opening a door to eternal tyranny by keeping vacant the seat of government. Because England is so far away, she can't govern the colonies. So if you can't govern effectively from a distance, somebody in the colonies is going to take over. A tyrant will rise up and take over. It's just a matter of time, he says. You can't maintain this ineffective, dangerous relationship with England because you're asking for someone else to step in and cause trouble. Now, here's where it gets really interesting and problematic. In this paragraph right here, he gets racist. And that's important because obviously racism is a constant throughout American history. And we have to be aware of it. We have to note it. We have to understand its influence. We never have to accept it, but we have to know it so that we can constantly call it out when we see it in our own lives. And here we can see in this very important document an example of racism. In this paragraph, he says, there are thousands and tens of thousands who would think it glorious to expel from the continent that barbarish and hellish power which has stirred up the Indians and Negroes to destroy us. Right? Here he is. He's talking race. The cruelty hath double guilt. It is dealing brutally by us and treacherously by them, meaning the Indians and the African slaves. To talk friendship with those with whom our reason forbids us to have faith, and our affections, wounded through 1,000 pores, instruct us to detest, it is madness and folly. Right? Here is where the racism comes in. To talk of friendship with Indians and black people, he says, those people who reason forbids us to have faith, and our affections instruct us to detest, meaning hate. He says, England's trying to get us to be friends with the Indians and the African slaves, and we hate them. Well, that's straight up racism. And he's using that to argue for revolution. And very important, America has always been motivated by a fear of the non-white minorities among them. And it starts right here. Right? So we know it. All right. I think that's enough for now on the content of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. You can see there's a couple of important things here. He uses metaphors. He uses counter-argument. And he uses appeals to reason to get people to see the facts in the way he wants them to see them. This is a great way for you to frame your arguments when you write in AP US History. Obviously, you're not going to use appeals to racism in your writing in U.S. history, but I pointed that out here because it's a fact of American history. There are many appeals we're going to see to racism to get people to do things. But you shouldn't buy into that. You should realize that it's a mistake and that it's obviously led to a terrible abuse over time. So that's it for here. Let me know what you think. Use this to review, use this to ask questions, use this to better understand important documents. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.
Till victory.